One of the things in our conversation about the state of the world is people are changing the way that they do business, and they're changing the way they relate to each other. And you hear things like, wow, I remember when a handshake used to be a man's bond, or a man's word was his bond. And people took the issues of integrity and character much more seriously than we do now. It used to be if somebody promised you something, then you could pretty much count on it being done because you knew the person and you knew the kind of person they were, and you knew that if they promised you something, that they would come through with it. There are lots of times in my life where my dad would make promises. Now, my dad had 3 jobs most of my life, 2 jobs all of my life. My dad started with nothing, and he's the one who kind of broke the poverty cycle in our home. But my dad was known for his integrity. He was known for the quality of his character. And if John Glenn told you something, then he would get it done. Now, if you were his kid, as I was, you knew to add a kind of clarifier to that, a one more phrase that kind of helped you understand. My dad, if my dad promised me something, it would get done eventually. But that was just my dad. Because from the time that he talked to me and made the promise to me, he had talked to 5 or 10 other people and made promises to them. And by the time he kept all the other promises, he would get my promise done. But it would be eventually. It would be a little longer than I had wanted to wait. It would be a little later than I wanted him to keep his word, but he would keep it. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he wonders why the Father has forsaken him. My God, why have you forsaken me? It must have been an awful moment for him. For the first time in his life, he could not readily experience the presence of the Father. That's what sin does. It makes you numb. We've talked about this before. And he couldn't feel the reality of the Father being with him. But here's what Jesus knew. Here's what Jesus never doubted. The character of the God who made the promise. That I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, I will never make you go through something all by yourself. I will always be there for you. Jesus, when he gave the Great Commission, reminded his disciples that as they were going into the world to make disciples, he would be with them even to the end of the earth. He would be with them. This promise of presence that we have throughout Scripture, that nothing will take you away from me, nothing will snatch you out of my hand. I will always be there. Paul, writing to Timothy, 2 Timothy, we think it was his last letter, says in the opening chapter that he is going through a lot. He is suffering a lot because he is a minister of the gospel. But he says, I go through all of this confident in whom I have believed. I'm confident in the person of God, the one that I have believed in. I know he will keep his promises to me. Now, I don't know what your circumstances are right now. We're all going through a very bizarre time in our lives. I don't know what your stresses are. I don't know what your worries are. I don't know what keeps you up at night. Here's what I do know. The promise that God would not leave us stands. And it doesn't stand because the life is easy or hard. It doesn't stand because you've done the work or I've done the work. It's not depending on you or it's not dependent on me. It is solely dependent on the character of God, a God who keeps his word, a God who makes promises and who keeps promises. And one of the things we need to do in a situation like we're going through right now is we need to take time and remember the times where God has been faithful. We need to take time. One of the important things of worship is we take time to look back and say, I remember where I was. I didn't know how I was going to get out of it. This is how God showed up, and I'm going to celebrate and worship him for that. This is where I was, didn't know how I was going to get out of it, and yet God showed up again. And so I celebrate that. And from that celebration, I get confidence to live in what I call the divine maybe. God was faithful here. He was faithful here. Maybe he will be faithful again. And he will be. Not because of who you are or who I am or what you've done or what I've done, but because of who God is. The faithfulness, the guarantee of the promise is in the character of God. The same yesterday, the same today, and the same tomorrow. The one who made the promise is faithful to keep it. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds. I want you to spend part of that time celebrating those moments where you didn't think God would show up, but he did. And I want you to remember several of them, enough where you got enough dots in your line that you can draw a line to the future. Now I want you to spend the next part of that time seeking God in this moment, looking for how he will keep his promise in the part of your life, on the part of your journey where you need him to keep his promise. Celebrate what he's done and look for how he'll be faithful again. Celebrate that the security of that promise isn't in what you've done or what I've done, but in who our God is. Take the 60 seconds, and I'll see you tomorrow.